Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams. Daniel, good to see you.
How are you this morning, Dr. Paul?
I am doing very well,
Good.
and we're going back to an old issue. I was hoping we wouldn't have to talk so much about Syria, but Syria is still on the table. And you know, a couple weeks ago, we were really guardedly excited about Trump's announcement. Time to come home. I'm taking them out. And it was really, a surprise decision, which bothered some of the neocons. Why didn't he tell us? Why didn't he discuss it with us? Well, we found out because the neocons got a foot in the door, went in, and Graham and a few others, and Rubio talked to him and got them to agree. Well, maybe we'd go a little bit slower. We can't get them all out of there in a week. But tell you what, if there was an emergency where we had to get them in, they'd get them in a week. I don't know why we just can't leave. But anyway, they talked them into slowing it up. But an incident yesterday sure has changed things a lot. And it's an amazing coincidence, and just how this came about, I guess, remains to be seen. But American troops were killed. Four of our personnel were killed, 3 were wounded, and a suicide terrorist did this. Oh, ISIS. Oh, there was a couple ISIS people left there. So therefore, boy, we really have to go slow now. Maybe we ought to quit. Maybe we ought to go in there until we really have victory over ISIS. Of course, they never want to stop and seek out the truth that ISIS didn't exist there till we got there.
Yeah.
And Assad never had a problem like that. And then the question also that they won't ask is, why do people commit suicide? This guy, at least the report showed, suicide terrorism. That he was so angry and upset about this, he would commit his suicide in order to kill Americans and try to chase us back. But the answer to this came because there was a time when I thought suicide terrorism was 100% due to radical Islamic beliefs, and yet Robert Pape, that we knew pretty well, he wrote a book called Dying to Win, and I think he's in Chicago. University of Chicago. And he's done a lot of research of this. And he came to another conclusion. So when I read the book, I said, I know he's wrong. I'm going to figure out how to answer him because it's religious, radical religious beliefs. So, but he convinced me otherwise. And his research showed that the number one issue that is associated with all the cases he studied was the fact that there were foreign invaders, foreign occupiers of a country, and that would, motivate them to commit suicide terrorism. And so we're there. We've been there a while. The longer we've been there, the more complicated the issue's gotten. And finally, Assad wins the war essentially, along with the help from the Russians. So they're at a point now where they've declared victory, but Trump worded it as it was a victory over ISIS, and to a degree that was true in spite of our policies. So this is not good news for gaining support for Trump, because it makes us worried that he's backed away a little bit. He's not as aggressive as he was, and now how are we going to help him and be confident that? Yes, he needs to get out of there. What are we there for? And all the arguments of this. So this is a bit of a setback for us winding down our efforts in Syria. And even those who support the troops leaving say, we have to be close by. And, we don't want anything to go bad. But it's better, but it's a far cry from the position we take. We just don't have any business there. We don't need to be intervening in the internal affairs of these nations. And in this case, we don't need to be. We shouldn't have been there. And the sooner we get out of Syria, the better.
And he's going to have problems not just with the neocons, not just with Washington's experts on foreign policy, but he's got all of the mainstream media against him. He's got New York Times, Washington Post, all the neocon publications, CNN, what have you, MSNBC. So it's going to be difficult for him to do this now. They're all saying the same thing. They're all singing from the same songbook, and saying the same thing. But the fact is, what I don't get, so ISIS does the one thing now that would lead the U.S. troops to stay. So that makes you wonder, okay, so ISIS wants a free reign in the region. They want to set up their caliphate. They want to regroup. They want to do all these things. So why would they do the one thing as an entity? Why would they do the one thing that's going to make the U.S. say, we better stick around and put pressure on? It reminds me of the chemical attacks. Right when Assad was ready to take over, name that town, all of a sudden he gasses the people and causes the U.S. to bomb him. I'm not saying it's a conspiracy, but it's awfully suspicious.
Yeah, it sure is, and the people are rallying. But what we find absent of joining in our position of let's encourage the president to do it. It used to be that that was a position of the Democrats, for decades, and they still have that image, which they don't deserve anymore, because I think they're mainly because Trump now wants to wind some of these wars down. So anything Trump does, it's wrong. So the Democrats are real cheerleaders for the militancy of this, and I wonder if they have anybody building weapons in their districts or something. Of course, everybody's district has weapon building going on, but it's not a very good sign when the parties are lining up differently. And to me, it's pretty disappointing that we don't see more people, from the Democratic Party willing to stick to a principle that they held. There's one or two young people that might change, and of course we will have to wait and see where that pans out. But right now, we can't expect any help from the position of the Democratic leadership to say, it does make sense to be less involved overseas. Maybe we can help more people at home. But they're afraid to say, if we did that, they might say, well, maybe we ought to deal with a wall here on Mexico border or something.
Well, so the ISIS attack was in Manbij, and ISIS was kicked out of there 2 years ago. It's controlled by the U.S.-backed Syrian Democratic Forces, which are de facto the Kurds, essentially. So what this says is simply that it's absurd to think that there will not be isolated attacks. I mean, ISIS being effectively defeated means they don't control any territory anymore. They don't have a big area. Actually, ironically, the only area, physical space they control is right next to the U.S. base in Al Tanf, and everyone's scratching their head about how that seems to work out. So essentially they are defeated, but there are going to be things like this. There are going to be individual terrorist cells, partially because they've been able to capture so many of the weapons that the U.S. has sent to the moderates over there. They've been able to arm themselves with tons and tons of cash. And, reportedly they bribe their way out. When they get into a pocket, they'll bribe anyone who will let them out. So this is going to happen. It's ridiculous to think that it's not going to happen. But, of course, the neocons will take anything they can to make the argument. In fact, Lindsey Graham, he, of course, blamed Trump. He said, even suggesting that we're going to leave emboldened ISIS, so it's your fault. But actually, if Trump had had his way last year and had the troops out of there, guess what? There'd be no Americans there to attack. Right. These 4 guys would have been alive.
There'd be no deaths, and that reminds me of the story that Ronald Reagan explained, in his biography. And that had to do with when he put the Marines in Beirut, and I think there were 263 or so Marines that were killed. Although even back in it was 1983 that myself and some others were arguing the case. Why are they there? And lo and behold, they were killed by a suicide terrorist. Now, the argument was similar, but Reagan acted quickly. Mm-hmm. He said, I'm coming out, and he took them out. And matter of fact, not only did that prevent any more Americans from being killed, it stopped the suicide terrorist attacks, because there were other suicide attacks and they were against Israel and others. But all the suicide attacks stopped, which, sort of is confirmed by what Robert Pape had said. It's the occupation. As soon as we removed our occupation, that was changed. But the interesting thing is when Reagan referred to this, because it was an embarrassing incident, because he had said, I'm going in there and I'm not going to turn tail. He used that, and I'm not going to leave. And lo and behold, instead of ducking the issue and not even mentioning it, he brought that up. And he says, I know I said this and all, but he said, I never realized how terrible and the word I don't know which
irrational,
irrational the politics of this region was. And once I knew that, I knew we had to get out. So it's very rare, that somebody will be, frankly, admit this. He says he should have. He said in the finishing of that paragraph was, if I hadn't gone in, those 240 some Marines would still be alive today, which is the point you made. If we had not been in there, those 4 Marines. But this is almost like blasphemy.
Yeah.
This is like, you can't do this. These people are, these soldiers, they're not victims of a bad policy. They're heroes, and we have to put them on a high pedestal in order to neutralize the stupidity of our foreign policy.
Yeah, and I would just say, I understand Reagan's view, and it's a great point, it's a great story. I wish other presidents would learn from that. But in a way, it wasn't that awfully irrational, because there were foreign troops occupying their soil, just like I'm sure if a foreign country started occupying Texas, there'd be a few Texans that'd be upset. They'd probably put some guns in their pickups and take care of it. So at the end of the day, not super irrational when you think about it. This is Mitt Romney. He's an old friend of yours, I think, so I hesitate to criticize him. But he encapsulates the neocon mindset. He put out a tweet yesterday, I think it was, and he said, "This attack is a reminder that the threat from ISIS persists, and the administration's decision to withdraw is a mistake." If you think about what that means, anywhere in the world that there's a threat from extremism, we can't leave. We got to go in. We got everywhere, the darkest Africa, the North Pole, the South Pole, everywhere there might be a terrorist threat, we've got to be there. And that's the mindset of people like Mitt Romney.
Yeah, I want to read a sentence or two from a statement that was put out by the ranking member on the Foreign Policy Committee in the House of Representatives, and that comes from Congressman McCall. And he was very upset and very disappointed that Trump was removing these troops, and he wanted to make sure on the record on that committee and the leadership, was not pleased with leaving. And he says, "I strongly urge the president to forcefully respond and ensure we do not withdraw our troops until ISIS is completely destroyed." That's pretty good. At least it sounds a little political, but this completely destroyed. And then when you think about terrorism is a tactic. It's like, until we eliminate every criminal in Syria, we're going to stay, because there's criminal acts and people kill each other. This sort of thing. But this whole obsession is always used politically to support a policy which makes no sense. And when they get exposed, they get very, very upset. And that is probably one of the biggest reasons. There's lots of reason for people to dislike and hate Trump. Mainly because he's in their face and he's bold and he doesn't back away.
Yeah.
But just remember, Kennedy got into trouble over foreign policy, and this is the whole thing. Foreign policy is a big deal, especially for the deep state and for the military-industrial complex and the New World Order. And this is what's, I think, the issue that drives the greatest amount of hatred toward Trump is the fact that he would even suggest that we not pursue this. But, there's just not enough support for him on the surface in the media. You mentioned the media, but I'm still convinced that young people, middle-aged people, the elderly would say, if they know the facts, why are we over there? It doesn't make any sense. There's no threat to our national security. It costs a lot of money. It's immoral because a lot of innocent people died. It's unconstitutional. It wasn't declared, and it's not going well. We keep losing. Now, who's not going to respond to that? But they don't. They demagogue this, and it's blasted all over the media. And besides, everybody has to find a reason to hate Trump. So now the Democrats find even a better reason to hate Trump. Oh, I know we used to believe in a more peaceful foreign policy, but we have to hate Trump consistently. So therefore, we can't let him get away with the slightest little change or improvement in his foreign policy.
Exactly. And as to the danger, a mugger will knife you for $20. Imagine what a military-industrial complex would do for $1 trillion a year.
Yeah.
So the other thing you talk about, the McCall statement, is really interesting, and this is our old friend Chuck Spinney coined the term, I think, a self-licking ice cream cone. This is a classic example of that because he says we have to stay there and fight until the last ISIS guy is gone. But in fact, our staying there and fighting is the biggest recruiting tool for ISIS. So we stay to fight ISIS, and our staying there recruits more ISIS, and we're there forever. We keep continuing the cycle. So this is essentially what people like McCall and the others are saying. This is not a very intellectually sophisticated opinion.
Well, this subject came up in the presidential debate and was very annoying to me because the suggestion was that if I didn't support, continuing the war in Iraq and other places, that meant the troops that had already died would have died in vain. And so therefore they wanted to send more troops and still make all the mistakes and have more people die in vain. It makes no sense. But that was their effort to try to ridicule a person that said that you don't want to do it because you don't care about the troops and you don't want anybody to die in vain. But the truth is, a better foreign policy and a non-interventionist foreign policy, there would be a lot less Americans dying in vain, let me tell you. And it's something that I was so pleased with in the campaign when I traveled to the college campuses and even talked to the military people, that they were quite willing to accept this idea that we did not have to be the aggressors and going and looking for a war to fight.
Yeah, exactly. The backdrop, just to kind of close things out, the backdrop of this whole thing we're talking about today is really something that U.S. has created with its intervention in Syria, and it has to do with the Turks and the Kurds. Manbij is up in the Kurdish-controlled area, obviously. Well, Turkey doesn't want a heavily armed, and they're heavily armed because we armed them, a heavily armed Kurdish population on the southern border. They've been at war with the Kurds for a while. So the U.S. has suggested a security zone. Okay, here's what we'll do. Security zone patrolled by the Turks inside Syria to keep the Kurds behaving themselves. Well, of course, this is the central part of where the Kurds live, their homeland. They're not going to accept Turkish occupation of their villages, of their populations. This is absolutely a non-starter. The Kurds would resist the occupation. So we find ourselves, because of our intervention, in this weird mediation between the Turks and the Kurds that there's no way it can go well. And ironically, actually, the only solution to the Kurd-Turk problem is being pursued by Turkey and Russia right now, where the Russians are going to, and Erdogan is going to meet Putin, where the Russians are going to suggest, okay, let's have the land returned to the Syrian government, i.e. it's the Syrian government land, and we're going to guarantee that the Kurds behave themselves. We'll give the Turks a guarantee. Everyone calm down and solve this. Makes the most sense, and it gives us the chance to get out. So hopefully that will be something they do. And my final word would be just to remind people, subscribe to Ron Paul Institute updates. I just put something out about this new fact checker group that's supposed to be so wonderful when in fact they're all full of neocons. I send out an article that I write just for you every week, ronpaulinstitute.org. Just go up there and subscribe, and you'll get this in your mailbox.
Very good, Daniel. And I want to just close by reiterating what I've already said many, many times in the past. We shouldn't be in the Middle East. We should only go there when it's a legal war declared by the people in the Congress and justify us being there. But we shouldn't be there for moral reasons. It's immoral for us to go and get involved in something that we shouldn't be involved in, and participating in the death of many, many people, our people as well as many others. And we should refute this whole notion that we're there for our national security. Nothing can be more absurd that we have to be in 130 countries for our national security, have these bases and participating in going bankrupt every year, and refusing to point out how powerful the military-industrial complex is in directing all these expenditures. And I think it's just outrageous that we've allowed our presidents, Republicans and Democrats, and our Congresses to to participate in these wars and finance these wars, and there's no constitutional justification for that. The founders tried hard to put the role of warmongering and all and fighting wars in the hands of the Congress and the people, but it hasn't worked, and it's only going to work if enough American people wake up and send a message of enough is enough. I lived through in the military in the 1960s, which was horrible with Vietnam, and just think of the tragedies that happened there until the Congress and the people woke up and had to demonstrate in the streets to finally say enough is enough. We're not winning, we're losing. Too many people have died, and we don't have to send more troops over there because we think that if we don't, we're guilty of letting our troops over dying in vain. That's nonsense. What we want to do is have a greater emphasis in protecting ourselves and protecting our security and protecting our liberty and setting a standard. We want to change the world in a positive way, but the only way that can be done for a free society is voluntarily and by setting an example, and that is what we don't have, and that's what we should be talking about, not putting our weight around and showing how powerful we are with our finances, that we can put sanctions on countries and tariffs on countries and punish people, and if they don't do what we tell them, we threaten them with our weapons. That has to change, because eventually it will change, and I would like to see it change, in a more reasonable way, instead of it changing with a calamity that we'll face if we don't change our positions both in economic policy, monetary policy, and on foreign policy. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.